Here Bethany has adapted her instruction based on what she's learned from students. They've described what their hypotheses are for the population fluctuations of the hares, but students are not sure what counts as a hypothesis, or what might make a strong hypothesis versus a weaker one. Bethany wants students to figure this out, but with guidance from her. She also wants students to hear and understand each other's hypotheses, so they have more exemplars than just their own.
What kind of data would you need to collect to test your hypothesis? So you're the scientist, you came up with this hypothesis, with this model, and you need to try to come up with some evidence that will help you support your hypothesis. So what would you need to do? What could you collect?
Someone starting fires in the area.
Okay, so what what data would you collect?
So we try and reenact that, not like in a big scale, but in a controlled environment where we could try and do that over and see if it actually works.
So you'd set a fire in a controlled area and then do what?
And then record the number of snowshoe hares and then see how many there are afterwards and how they reproduce and stuff.
Okay, so you'd like okay. What do you think might happen?
I think it decreased because obviously some of them could, maybe some can't get away from the fire enough, and then after that there's no more places for them to hide if all the trees are.
Okay, great. I would actually like just a couple people right now to tell us what they were thinking about here. There's some different kinds of data that you were thinking about collecting. So we'll share more of these ideas with the group, but I just want to hear a couple of different kinds of data that people could collect. And so, Cialan, could you start with yours and tell us what you were thinking about?
I can observe what they're eating.
Okay, so she wants to just go into the area and observe what they're eating. And what would that tell you? How they're living. And then you also wrote down on your paper to see if they eat other things. So kind of to think about what they're eating and what else they could eat. Okay, so hers was like an observation in the wild there and seeing what happens.
So if we were able to obtain data on the history of like wildfires in the area, that would help us, because we thought of like, do you want me to explain like how we're going to do it or why it's going to help us?
Well,
okay, so it would help us because our hypothesis was about some guy coming into the forest and burning the trees down. And we thought that maybe if we were able to like get a controlled, like have a controlled area and then like burn it a little bit, not too much, and then figure out what happens to the animals before and after, it might be able to explain what's going on in the graph.
okay. And I think Elpido, yours was similar, right? Elpido's was similar. He wanted to see the effects of the fire.
Yeah, put up like cameras.
Okay, so his is putting cameras in the area to watch what happens when a fire happens. So they both are kind of observing the effects of the cause that they're thinking about. And then somebody else said something about just collecting the history of the area. So who had one like that?
I was thinking
All right, so what were you thinking of? What could you collect a history of?
I was just thinking.
Okay. How about, go ahead, Val.
Something I would need is the natural disaster history of their habitats.
And what would you do with that?
See if that's affecting their food source or themselves.
Okay, so they're going to think about how they're going to take a look at the history and see how a graph that we talked about would match with that history. So those are all three different ways that you could collect information, evidence to help you support your hypothesis. And we're going to be keeping on thinking about this today. And so we're going to start by, we're going to do what's called a jigsaw. I'm sure you've done one of these before, where you start in your group and each of you kind of becomes an expert. And then you get in a group of, with one person from each of the groups, and you share your ideas. So you'll start with your group that you've been working with, and you're just going to refresh your memory about your hypothesis, and also think about how it relates to the 35-yard graph, and maybe even share your ideas about how you would collect evidence, and so collect data. And so when we split up, then all the A's will sit together at table 1, the B's will sit together at 3, C's at table 5, D's at table 7. And then you'll pass out the orange cards at those tables so that you all have a role to play there. So some of you still might be a skeptic, or you might be a questioner as a chance to ask that group about their hypothesis. And then I have a note sheet for you that I'll pass out when you get there, but it gives you a chance to record what each group thinks is happening as the hare population rises and as it decreases. Because as the unit goes on, we're going to look for evidence that supports each of our own hypotheses, but we're also going to look for connections between our hypotheses and evidence that can support more than one.
What's table 1?
On Friday, you had some discussions about how your ideas go with this, and you kind of felt like challenged by it. So can you say a little bit more about that?
So we felt it was challenged because the predators aren't going to be put on the endangered species list every 5 years.
Okay. And so then that's fine. You can share that with the groups that you're going to and explain kind of what you were originally thinking and then how it doesn't necessarily match with this. And then explain what you would, like now what you're wondering. That's okay. What I'd like to see now is we'll start with person 1 and you'll just go through, you'll explain your group's hypothesis, what you were thinking about, how it matches or doesn't match well with the 35-year graph, and how you were thinking you could collect evidence. The rest of your group will listen and record notes about what you say. So what I do want to see is, for example, what I do want to see is if, like, for example, Elpidio was telling me about his graph or his hypothesis, he would be like pointing to it, telling me, and I would be writing down. What I don't want to see is Elpidio to do this and say, here, just read my graph and write down some notes. Okay? So I really want to hear you explaining your ideas to your group.
The predators would be right here, and they would go down. So that's why, like, the hares would go up in their babies because the predators wouldn't attack them. And my hypothesis is that the predators would, the poachers would come and attack the predators and they would be extinct. So they would always go up and they would go back down. But then the challenge was the one in the 35 wouldn't fit the 10-year one because I don't think the it would make sense because the predators wouldn't be extinct every 5 years. So it wouldn't fit.
Every year.
So you guys understand what she was saying? So then you might have to ask some clarifying questions or use some of your orange cards there, but explain why their group thought the hare population increased and then why the population decreased. Why would the hare population increase?
Since the predators can be hunted, there's going to be more of them.
So say it again, Kevin.
The people came and they killed the people.
All the predators.
Okay, so it's about people killing the predator, not the actual hares. Okay.
They migrate to the forest and they start hunting all the hares. The coyotes migrate to the forest and start hunting.
And that makes them decrease? Because
there's more predators.
Does anybody have any orange questions for him?
Why do you think that?
I don't know.
Can you relate it to something that you've heard of before?
Wait, what I think what?
Yeah, ask her. Why does he think what?
Why do you think that predators aren't hunting as much?
Because the hare population increases.
So why would the hare population increase?
Because the predator hunted them.
The predators hunted them.
Yeah, there we go.
Wait, so I think I know you.
Okay, so how can you
So
say
I
it?
think he's saying that the hare population would increase because the hare's predator becomes a prey, but then it would decrease because the hare's predator's predator would decrease. Yeah.
Our hypothesis name is called the hunting of the hares.
The what?
The hunting of the hares. And our explanation for this hypothesis is that like some of the like between these years, they the hares in the graph they basically they were hunted, but they were also reproducing, so they were at like a steady straight line, so it didn't decrease or increase. And as it moved on over to 2 years, that the hares started reproducing more because of the predators are like not hunting them fairly good enough, that their population started to increase. And once then between here and here, a new predator came, which was the coyote, and it started hunting more effectively of the hares. But in the reading, it said that the coyotes weren't like living in the boreal forest before. So I'm guessing that our group guessed that our group guessed that they came, they migrated into the boreal forest and started hunting the hares.
I have a question. If the coyotes migrated over there, why didn't they just keep eating the hares?
Because less food, so I guess they must have migrated back. Saying there's not enough food here anymore, so let's go find another source of
So
food.
they would travel back and forth. Once they migrated over where the hares are, they started eating it, but the food starts to decrease. So they decided to go back, but then the food over there, where they migrated back, would probably decrease over there and move back and forth.
So does that match what you said, Serena? Okay. So is there anything you can be skeptical about there?
So what would cause the balance right here?
We said that for the graph to be like all in a wave-like pattern, is that in some years the coyotes leave and then they come back.
Yeah, but what would cause the balance?
Oh, wait.
What would cause that straight line? Yeah.
This was before the coyotes came.
So how do the coyotes how does coyotes end up in the northern hemisphere?
We have a personal experience where at my grandparents' house we saw a coyote. No, it was not a snow fox. It was. But, yeah. And it started eating the chickens.
What we said in year 0, the snowshoe hare had just been introduced to the area, and after year 2, the hare population began to increase greatly due to inability of predators. But by year 5, predators or destruction of habitat had begun to greatly affect the snowshoe hare population, causing it to decrease immensely.
How did the population increase?
The population began to increase greatly because the inability of predators to hunt them.
Your answers to these 3 questions in your journal. What do most of your hypotheses have in common? What are some elements they have in common? what are some things that are unique to only one or two groups? And just, so for all these you're going to explain. And then 3, is there one that you think seems to be the strongest? Is there one emerging as the strongest hypothesis? Why or why not?
So what do we all have in common?
Predators.
Except mine. Yeah, that means you can't see predators because not all of us have it in common.
Well, did we all say like they repopulated? Okay, so we can write that down.
That's obvious. No, you shouldn't do that.
That they can reproduce.
It's a last resort.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody else.
Yeah, especially with yours, Kayla. It's very different from everyone else's.
Sorry for being different.
It's okay. Being different's alright.
Alright, y'all.
Yeah.
Oh, I know what happened with the common. Food increases. For each one, the food increases like that. The predators. You guys didn't say anything. No, not food, but like well, like food, but like predators. Like the predators' food increases, and then
we didn't write that down.
Oh no! I mean, they were explaining how you two explained how as the hair increases, that means the predator's food increases. Well, for the strongest element, we would have to say food increase.
Okay, for food increase. What do you mean by food?
Like, predators have food, which is the hairs. So as they increase, that means their food increases.
Okay. And why do you all think that's the most important? Or, no, sorry, that's what you all have in common. So everyone says that, or most of them have it?
Like either way they increase in some way, and then either way they go down in some way, which is like related to predators or something else.
Okay. And so, what are some of the things that you had that weren't, that maybe only a few groups talked about?
The destruction of habitat would be the unique one.
Can you say that a little louder?
The destruction of habitat would be the unique one.
Okay, that's unique. Why?
Because only 6 of us shared it, and nobody else had the same thing.
And did nobody else have that as part of their thinking, or just part of what they said as the most important idea? Like, did your group think about habitat? Did yours? Serena, did yours? Okay, so nobody's group thought about the habitats.
The hare's food increases, right? So they have a lot of food, and they're eating a lot, and then they reproduce, so they have a high population. And then it decreases because the food decreases, and then they run out of food to eat, and then they die.
Yeah, they die off slowly.
And how do they gain more food?
The food will rapidly decrease, and meaning they will reproduce more because they have a lot more food.
Why does their food like decrease out of
Because like the climate could change. You don't know.
And then, so out of all of yours, have you come to some sort of consensus on which hypothesis seems to be the strongest? Are we ready to go there?
So, in the beginning, the predators ate the same amount of hares that were being born. Like, they were at a steady rate. And then, after 2 years, the poachers began to kill the predators, which made the hares increase in population. And then, after that happened, the predators were put on the endangered species list, so they couldn't be hunted anymore. Then the predators became more unpopulated, so then the hares became less populated because the predators were.
Okay, and you already all talked about how that goes with the 35-year graph?
That's why I disagreed.
Because?
I would increase again.
Great question, you guys can discuss that, and then get some ideas written down.
Ooh, mine's better.
So, what have you written down about those questions?
Mine works with the graph.
Alright, so I've asked each group to have one person share what their group talked about, so what they heard in common, what they thought was kind of maybe stood out as unique to one group, and then what they thought was the strongest. And I've heard something different from each table, so that'll be interesting to hear. Okay, and say it nice and loud, because those people are kind of, the tables 1 and 7 are pretty far back, so you'll have to say it pretty loud.
Ones that are in common for us would be predators.
Because?
Because all of ours have predators.
except one. And the most unique one would be 2-4 because they were the only ones that had food increasing and reproduction.
All right, and then what did you decide was the strongest one?
If you were to connect all of them.
Can you say that really loud?
If you were to connect all of them together.
Okay, and say a little bit more about your thinking about that.
Because like there's not one that really stands out because they all like are basically the same. So if you would put like 2 or 3 or 4 together, it would probably make sense more.
Okay, so what you're saying is, because I heard you just say like they're all pretty much the same, but are they really the same? Okay, so can you say a little bit more about that?
Saying like that there's just multiple reasons that affect it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I brought up that, like, because then they're all similar, but there's, like, something little, like, that's different about it. So, like, if you were to put them all together, it would make it strong hypothesis because it has, like, more little details in it.
Okay, so they're
like predators and stuff.
So there's more details and more. Okay.
Which makes it stronger if they all put together.
Okay, so they're saying if we put them all together, it's going to make it stronger.
The one that we all had in common was we all mentioned reproduction of the hare population.
Okay.
And the unique one was Alyssa's group because they were the only ones to ever think of poachers in the whole thing.
Okay, and then what did you all decide was the strongest one?
And everyone thought it was my group's hypothesis because we were the only one to mention crazy cigarette guy. Okay. Like every 11 years, some crazy cigarette guy comes around and burns some. You told me to say every year, 11 years, this guy comes and he burns down half of the forest, like most of the forest, and then the increase is when that vegetation is coming back for the hares, but then he comes back, so it decreases population again.
All right, and so why did you all decide that was the strongest hypothesis?
I couldn't decide on anything else. And they really liked the idea. They said it was very specific.
So the fact that it was like really specific about what happens made you kind of like it as far as an explanation?
Sure.
We are going to keep thinking about this idea right here about which ones of these do we have more evidence for? You all are going to be looking for evidence to support your hypothesis, but we're also going to look for ways to connect our hypotheses together and make an explanation that includes more than one element. Thank you for your hard work today.